When you think about British directors, names like Alfred Hitchcock, David Lean, and Christopher Nolan probably spring to mind, and for good reason. These top British directors have directed a number of great films, and are well remembered because of that. Unfortunately, people can only remember so much, and there is limited space at the top. Many other directors often fly under the radar, making enjoyable and entertaining films that are good, but might not be the most cinematic, memorable, or award-winning films. One British director that I think flies under the radar too often is Peter Yates. Now, depending on your film knowledge, you may know who he is, or you might have never heard of him before. Even if you haven't, you have most likely heard of Bullitt, the classic crime thriller that defined what a car chase should be. Unsurprisingly, this is what the film is most well remembered for, and for good reason. It's an epic chase through the cascading streets of San Francisco that is accompanied by the sounds of the powerful muscle cars piercing the silence. The chase is extremely engaging and timeless. But Yates didn't start out with Bullitt, and to find out how he got to that point, we have to go all the way back to 1967 with the film Robbery. The idea for Robbery didn't actually come from Yates, but rather producer Michael Deely. Deely was interested in making a movie about the Great Train Robbery that took place in Britain in 1963. The robbery was conducted by a group of men who managed to hijack a Royal Mail train carrying over £2.6 million, which, in today's money, is around £46 million, according to the Bank of England's inflation calculator, making it, at the time, Britain's largest robbery ever committed. Naturally, a robbery of this size made it very notorious in the press and the public conscience, and many people wanted to make a film on the incident. Many tried and many failed, for a number of reasons, but it was predominantly down to legal issues, as the court case was still ongoing when the attempts were made. Eventually, there was a successful attempt in 1965 with a German miniseries that was later re-edited into a feature-length film and then dubbed into English and given the name The Great Train Robbery. Deely, still interested in the idea, acquired the film rights to Peter Fordham's book, The Robber's Tale, which is an account of the robbery. Deely, at the time, was working for Woodfall Films and brought it to their attention. Woodfall, however, was not interested in pursuing the idea, but Deely was so passionate about it that he decided to resign from Woodfall and look for someone who would produce the film. Michael Deely searched around and approached Stanley Baker to help produce and star in the film. Baker had come off the success of Zulu a couple years prior and was still in the good graces of American producer Joseph E. Levine. Baker managed to get Levine on board to help finance the film. With funding secured, Deely went looking for a director and remembered working with Peter Yates on the film One Way Pendulum. Deely thought that he would be the perfect choice for the film, and Yates agreed to take the job. The plot of Robbery loosely follows what actually happened, taking its time showing us the main criminals, how they formed the crew, setting up the job, and then committing the robbery, resulting in a hide-and-seek chase between the police and the criminals, interweaving character drama and side plots that are intertwined into the main story, giving it some originality that separates it from just being a direct retelling of the crime. This was done mainly for the story and the characters, even though Yates' objective was to try and make it as close to the truth as possible. This wasn't feasible, however, as at the time of making the film, there was still ongoing legal cases that required many changes. Yates later remarked in an interview that they had more lawyers than writers on the film.
All I know is we have more lawyers than writers.
I bet, yes.
There were also changes because in Britain, the opinion of the time was that it wasn't healthy to show that crime paid. Ironically, this must have been forgotten by the distributor, whose original release poster had this nice tagline. While the story loosely follows what actually happened, the characters were virtually all completely changed. Once again, this was done for legal reasons, and this went so far that the actors playing the characters were not even allowed to know which real-life criminal they were portraying. The film has quite a few characters, but not very many of them are actually important or have any development. There's only 3 that have any real development, and the main one is Paul Clifton, played by Stanley Baker. Baker plays a tough guy persona pretty well, and you really get this sense that he's a ruthless career criminal who's all about professionalism and getting the job done right.
Things will be easier on the night.
It was too slow. We've got 45 minutes to the outside. I want it done in 25.
Naturally, being the main character, we get to see the most character development and interactions from him. One of the main points of interest for his character is seeing his relationship with his wife, Kate Clifton, played by Jonah Patet. Patet plays the character fine and does a perfectly acceptable job in portraying her concern and distress at her husband's life and work.
I'll never put you through that again, Kate. You bloody hypocrite.
However, this side drama between the two is not that great and is pretty pointless, ultimately not developing much outside of showing that Paul, even in his love life, is a cold and uncaring man.
Stop!
It feels more like filler than anything meaningful, sadly. The only other character to get any real development is Robinson, played by Frank Finley. Finley plays the reluctant and timid banker very well. He gives a nice contrast to all of the other criminals, easily being more sympathetic and likable since he was more forced against his will to participate in the crime, rather than actually wanting to be an accomplice since he is under threat of harm against his wife.
I don't want any trouble.
Neither does your wife, I should imagine.
Someone he holds very dear to him. Outside of these three, we don't really get any major character development or see much of a relationship between any of the other characters. I find it disappointing, but I don't think it's a huge deal breaker, as the film is engaging enough and the story, while not entirely accurate, is entertaining and competent. While most of the other characters don't get much development, all of them are played pretty well by a great lineup of notable British actors from the time. While there isn't much in the way of relationships between the characters, there are some nice smaller moments in the film between some of the criminals. Obviously, because of the amount of characters, it was harder to give them all some development, and what's interesting is according to Gerald Wilson, who wrote the original script, there was a lot more development between the characters, which was mainly for the robbers.
Remember, I had more relationships between the men.
But Yates cut it down in favour of having a shorter film. Wilson also didn't have the great car chase at the start of the film in the original script. Yates wanted a chase scene, however, and decided to put one in the film, which went against what Wilson wanted.
I argued the chase was unnecessary, was better to show the brilliance of the airport robbery rather than a 6-minute car chase.
I personally completely disagree with his take here, as not only is the car chase amazing to watch, but it's also important. It shows that while the criminals are professionals, being able to pull off the job and outrun the police, they are somewhat reckless, taking unnecessary risks that could end them up in jail and ultimately is a factor which leads to them getting caught in the end. While also subtly showing us, the audience, more of Paul Clifton's character, as he is shown not to be involved with the reckless car chase and is far away from the action, minimizing his potential to get caught, something which is once again shown at the end of the film. Outside of that, the car chase was also important for Yates as it laid the foundation and helped develop his technique for the epic car chase that would take place in Bullitt. Robbery's chase is quite a spectacle itself. The race between the criminal's Jaguar S-Type and the police's Jaguar Mark II is entertaining and intense. The close-up shots of the drivers and the wide shots of the cars zooming past helped build the chase, along with cutting between the criminals, police, and police headquarters. The POV shots inside the car really get right down into the action and give you a sense of all of the twists and turns the cars are making. A lot of the credit for this spectacular chase needs to go to the camera operator, Chick Waterson. His use of putting himself and the camera directly into the car in order to shoot the close-up shot of the drivers was rather unorthodox back in 1967, but is pretty standard today. This brings me to the tone and style of Robbery. Robbery is a British film, but it's a much more Americanized British crime film compared to its contemporaries, and this is on purpose. Not only did Yates want to make the film more Americanized, but Joseph E. Levine's American money in the film also helped push it in that direction, even though he personally didn't think the film had much appeal for the American audience.
The American distributor Joe Levine, he said, this film doesn't necessarily have as much appeal for the American audience as it could have.
Because of this, the style is significantly different from your typical British crime film, and it's also one of the main reasons why there is that whole subplot with Paul and Kate. In the 60s, a female love interest in a film would draw in more American audience members, and it was preferable if said love interest was American and played by an American actress, although, in Robbery, Kate isn't American and neither is Patet. The overall tone of the film is quite cold and grimy, with the characters, atmosphere and setting. Shots often feel far away, allowing you to take in some of the locations and environments which feel cold and devoid of life. The slow pace of the film adds to this, as some scenes like to linger. Most of the film was shot on location, in areas that really give you that dirty and dingy backstreet aesthetic, but that's not to say the whole film was like this. There are many scenes which have a warmer atmosphere to them, specifically the indoor ones. One scene that I think contrasts the warm and the cold exceptionally well is the actual robbing of the train. The inside of the train has this nice warm, bright feel, only for it to be ripped away when the robbers start breaking in and letting the cold outside air in. You can even see some of the actors' breath because it was so cold when they were filming. The film, mostly focusing on the criminals, adds to this cold feeling, with some of their personalities being particularly icy.
You were in the moment you came over that wall.
Even the police, who are not featured as much as the criminals, still give off that feeling. When it comes to criticism for the film, I have already discussed the lack of character development and the relationship between Paul and Kate, but I want to bring up some other points of criticism. In terms of cinematography, it is quite stale outside of the car chase, where it almost takes on a life of its own with how different it is from the rest of the film, with the shot types and editing. Outside of that, there's not too much movement or variety of angles. There are some Dutch angles and zooms, but nothing too creative. Overall, it's serviceable, but it's kind of disappointing when comparing it to the car chase because it's just so different. Another criticism I have is the real lack of music. Other than the opening scene, the music is not very pronounced and is often subdued. I feel that in some of the tense scenes, they could have added some music that would have either built up the tension or added to how tense the scene was. That's not to say that the little music the film has isn't good, as I really enjoyed the opening theme. There are a couple of scenes with diegetic sound,
as the crime of the century,
which is a cool inclusion, but it's nothing too crazy. Overall, the production went pretty smoothly, as Yates knew exactly the film he wanted to make, but he did have a couple of problems, leading to quite a lot of pressure being put onto Yates by Baker due to how stretched the budget was. Despite this, and some of the film's shortcomings, I really enjoyed Robbery and thought it was an excellent British crime film. It has some great standout moments, such as the car chase at the start of the film, and the actual train robbery. It's also full of gripping and tense moments that keep your attention throughout. Its strengths lie in its story, use of authentic locations, and cast of great actors. While it's not entirely accurate to the real events, it still tells the story of the Great Train Robbery in a competent and entertaining way. When Robbery released in 1967, it was a very topical film and became a success in Britain. In other territories, it was not as successful and had limited distribution in America. Surprisingly, despite its limited distribution, superstar Steve McQueen saw the film after reading Howard Thompson's review in the New York Times. McQueen liked the film and the car chase so much that he personally invited Yates to come to America and direct a film for him. The elements and techniques Yates used in Robbery would lay the groundwork and go a long way in helping him to create Bullitt, making it the legendary film it is today, especially when it comes to the car chase. Bullitt started with producer Philip D'Antoni, acquiring the rights to the book Mute Witness by Robert L. Fish. D'Antoni intended to make a film based on the book, with Spencer Tracy as the star, but when he died in 1967, Steve McQueen took over the project instead. McQueen decided to produce the film with his production company, Solar Productions, and brought in Robert E. Rayler as co-producer. The trio began developing the project, and during that time, McQueen saw Robbery and invited Yates to come direct Bullitt. Yates considered himself extremely lucky to have this opportunity to work with Steve McQueen, and accepted McQueen's invitation. It was to be Yates' first film he made in America, and because of this, he was able to give a fresh perspective on America, being somewhat of an outsider to the country and culture. Yates was first shown the script of Bullitt by McQueen, and once he had read through it, he thought it was
Absolutely terrible. I mean, I couldn't believe it.
thinking it wasn't for him, and he had made a mistake coming to America. He wasn't the only one that thought the script was bad either. Robert Vaughn, who plays Chalmers in the film, had the script sent to him 4 different times by McQueen.
Steve sent me the movie Bullitt in its original draft form, but I went send it back to him 3 or 4 times saying this movie doesn't make any sense.
The original script that Yates and Vaughn read was drastically different to what we got with the final film. The script was originally set in Los Angeles, but Yates wanted to shoot in San Francisco because, according to him,
We chose to shoot in San Francisco because I felt it would give me more freedom.
the original script also had no chase scene, but that would be changed later. After Antoni saw the chase scene in Robbery, many other aspects of the script were changed as well, including the story. The story of Bullitt is a bit more complex and is not as straightforward as the one in Robbery, with it focusing on a couple of stories that cross over each other and intertwine to create one flowing narrative. The main story of Bullitt follows Detective Frank Bullitt and his assignment to protect a star witness for a big ongoing case. The witness is in grave danger, being hunted down by some ruthless gangsters who will stop at nothing to make sure the witness lies 6 feet under. The gangsters aren't the only thing that Bullitt has to watch out for. Politician Walter Chalmers, who is heading up the case, is constantly on his back about the safety of his star witness. A cat and mouse game between Bullitt, the gangsters, and Chalmers ensues through the streets of San Francisco, with plenty of action, drama, and tension to keep any audience member entertained. Bullitt is slightly different to Robbery with its characters, choosing to focus more on the police rather than the criminals, basically the reverse of Robbery. It's also the reverse of Robbery as it gives more time to the characters rather than the story. Bullitt also has a lot less characters than Robbery, and because of this, those characters get a lot more character development and are a lot more interesting than the ones in Robbery. It does help that Bullitt isn't trying to retell history and has more freedom in its story and characters. The main character is Frank Bullitt, played by Steve McQueen, and McQueen does an excellent job at giving us one of his best performances. He really embodies Bullitt and he brings his character to life. Even with the little dialogue he has, McQueen is able to subtly show us Frank's character through his movements and facial expressions. Even though Bullitt is a high-ranking and competent detective, he is portrayed as a down-to-earth guy like the rest of us. Throughout the entire film, we get a good glimpse into his daily life, both during and outside of work. We see him waking up late.
What time did you get to bed this morning, Frank?
About 5.
Getting groceries, having a love life, going out for dinner, and even failing in some of the aspects of his job. It makes you relate to the character a lot more, as he is not some super cop who is good at everything and does no wrong. He does things he shouldn't, and he has genuine flaws. He even struggles with his relationship. This all naturally builds over the course of the film, and as you go through it, you really get a sense of who Frank really is. This was done on purpose by McQueen and Yates, as the pair wanted to show the human side to a police officer and show people that they were just like everyone else, especially as at the time, the police were not very well liked in San Francisco. When Yates changed the setting from LA to San Francisco, McQueen became hesitant to play the role, but was assured that he would be able to show the human side of them and even show that they can question the powers that are above them. That power above them is Walter Chalmers, played by Robert Vaughn. Vaughn plays the character pretty well, showing Chalmers to be shrewd and calculating with a large ego, leading to confrontations with Bullitt in an almost Western standoff-like fashion.
Lieutenant, I shall personally officiate at your public crucifixion if Ross doesn't recover during the course of the hearing, so I can at least present his deposition.
Ironically, when Robert Vaughn wanted to go into politics long after the film came out, People remembered how he played Chalmers, and it hurt his potential image as a politician. Chalmers, while initially presented as an ally to Bullitt, turns out to be more of an enemy, constantly hindering Bullitt rather than helping him. The two had different methods and approaches to the situation. Chalmers wants to get the case done his way rather than Bullitt's way of doing things, and when he doesn't get that, he puts pressure on Bullitt's chief to get what he wants. He's manipulative and cruel, but hides it behind a veneer of fake smiles and promises, just like any good politician. While Chalmers overall isn't in the film too much, he does pop up here and there to haunt Bullitt. You get this sense that he's always lurking close by, making sure events play out in his favour. He's a great character that puts a third side into the mix. Bullitt doesn't only have to deal with Chalmers, but also his girlfriend, Kathy, played by Jacqueline Bisset. Bisset plays the supporting character fine, although it's not a very standout performance in my opinion. Yates chose Bisset to play the character because he thought that she had a very sincere quality to her. Frank's and hers relationship is 100 times better and more fleshed out than the one in Robbery, coming off as a lot more natural and interesting, not feeling forced or shoved into the story for the sake of it. The time is actually taken to show their relationship develop over the course of the film, and while it's an already established relationship, you do see it grow. Naturally, this was a lot easier to show in Bullitt, with Frank being the natural good guy of the story, compared to Robbery's Paul Clifton, who was a criminal and not a very likeable one at that. It also shows Bullitt's human side, as he has to deal with the problems of the relationship, complicated by his high-pressure job. The complexities of the job highlight the darker side to Frank's work, and how he is just as much in the dirt and grime with the criminals.
You're living in a sewer, Frank. Day after day.
The only difference is, he gets to escape it for a short period of time when he goes home. Yates was not sure about having the relationship in the film until very late into pre-production, most likely aware of the negative criticism the previous relationship in Robbery attracted. Thankfully, Yates decided to retain the relationship, which certainly made Bullitt more relatable. Bullitt has a couple of other minor characters, like Captain Sam Bennett, played by Simon Oakland, and Detective Delaghetti, played by Don Gordon. Both do well enough and contribute to the story in meaningful ways. In terms of characters, Yates really improved in this area, giving us a more refined selection of characters that are well developed and fleshed out. Frank Bullitt is a great main character that really elevates the story, and Chalmers is a good counterweight to Bullitt, with the two's differing opinions and ambitions. With Yates just coming off of Robbery, a lot of the tone and style of that film bleeds heavily into Bullitt, with many elements that Peter Yates used in that film once again being replicated here in Bullitt. The main one that you will notice right away is the music over the opening credits, setting up the film and grabbing your attention, bringing you right into the action as opposed to Robbery, which took a little bit longer. Speaking of music, it's a major step up from Robbery, with the music being a lot more pronounced in the quantity and volume. The soundtrack was done by Lalo Schifrin, and he made an excellent number of jazz tracks that fit in with the time period and the theme of the film. Many of them perfectly complementing the scene that they are featured with, especially with helping to build tension while also knowing to black out the music and let the action or drama speak for itself. Yates also brings back his use of diegetic sound, with there being a couple of scenes where the music is directly incorporated into the scene. Another big stylistic choice was to have the film shot almost entirely on location. Yates always preferred shooting on location rather than shooting in a studio. McQueen and cinematographer William Fraker also liked the idea of shooting almost entirely on location. This resulted in the film being a lot more real compared to if it was shot almost entirely in a studio, and this helped enhance the realistic tone that Yates and McQueen were hoping for. None of it would have been possible without the enormous cooperation of the city and police of San Francisco, who are more than happy to have a major film shot in their city, as most films at the time skipped over San Francisco for LA. The major thing that was brought over from Robbery to Bullitt was the car chase. It might surprise you to know that both Yates and McQueen were somewhat hesitant to do the car chase. Yates had just done one in Robbery, and McQueen was going to do one for a racing film. But at the last minute, they changed their minds, and because of this, they were only given 2 weeks at the end of the shooting schedule to film it. Yates and McQueen both wanted a proper car chase that showcased the real skill of the drivers and not just cars crashing about. Yates always loved doing a car chase and thought they were so satisfying as long as they worked well. Just like Robbery, the car chase is fast and intense, but unlike Robbery, it takes its time ramping up, building up the tension with the music before suddenly cutting off and having the sounds of the powerful muscle cars explode out onto the streets of San Francisco. What ensues is one of the greatest car chases in cinematic history. It's fast, it's intense, and it's powerful, aided greatly by the cinematography and editing, which helped separate the car chase from being boring and generic. It's highly enjoyable and creative, especially for the time it was made. The fast editing with the close-up shots of the drivers really brings you right into the action, and then those combined with some nice long shots that showcase the scale of the car chase and allow the action to breathe. To get the close-up shots, Fraker sat in the car with the camera, just like Watterson did for Robbery. Yates wanted to advance his style from Robbery and bring a more Western feel to the film, but modernize some of those Western aspects, keeping it away from the typical police story that you would see from around the time. Both him and McQueen wanted to make Bullitt more realistic and something more in line with reality than fiction. Hence why Bullitt is a lot more violent compared to Robbery, and that violence is also shown in bloody detail. Yates was determined to make Bullitt have a dirty and grimy feel, giving you a real sense for the darker side of San Francisco and what police work was really like. In terms of realism, I think it's something they succeeded in, especially concerning the car chase. I mean, this shot here, for instance, is actually the car crashing, but it looks so good they kept it in. It's just little things like that make Bullitt so much better. Overall, Bullitt is a very solid film, but my main problem with Bullitt is the story. It feels confusing and very disjointed at times, which isn't helped when it's often overshadowed by the character drama. The opening scene doesn't help you get accustomed to the story either, as it's quite confusing and doesn't give you enough time or background information to process what's going on. While I know the opening was designed that way in order to grab your attention, I don't think it was done the best, grabbing your attention in the wrong way. In my opinion, it's the weakest part of the film, but depending on your opinion, you may not find this to be an issue, as a lack of story makes way for other things, such as the action and the characters. Bullitt is a major step up from Robbery in so many ways, and the fact that they were made only a year apart is impressive. It's a classic, and deservedly so, with there being so many great moments, not just from McQueen, but also from Robert Vaughn and Simon Oakland. While the story is somewhat lacking, the characters, action, and car chase more than make up for that, along with William Fraker's great cinematography and the on-location shooting in San Francisco. Yates considered himself lucky that he got the opportunity to work with McQueen, but he was never intimidated by McQueen and his fame. This probably helped the production, as they both clearly had respect for each other, and Yates did state he had a good time making it, which is obvious to see because Yates and McQueen were definitely on the same wavelength when making Bullitt. Their shared love for cars and wanting to present a realistic cop story definitely helped to make the film what it is, and especially in creating the iconic car chase that I could watch over and over again. The freedom Yates got in the film and the protection he got from McQueen certainly helped as well, although according to Yates, the studio thought Bullitt was going to be a disaster. Fortunately for Yates and McQueen, Bullitt would turn out to be an enormous success, and this helped Yates establish himself in America, allowing him to pursue other projects outside of just crime films. Yates said he is proud of the film and that he liked making action and crime films, but he also enjoyed making films in other genres. He also didn't want to be pigeonholed into making just one genre of film. Yates would take a break from crime films and go on to make John and Mary, which was a romantic drama. Then he moved into war films with Murphy's War, once again teaming up with Michael Deely, who would produce the film. But after the film's less than stellar box office performance, Yates decided to return to crime films with The Hot Rock. The film is a more comical take on the heist film, being somewhat different from his previous, hard-hitting, gritty crime thrillers of the past. But once again, it failed to make a profit, so Yates decided to go back to what worked. His next film, The Friends of Eddie Coyle, would be a return to the older, more gritty crime films he first found success with. In the early 70s, Yates had signed a 4-movie deal with Paramount Pictures. He had been working on 3 scripts for the potential films, but he was still lacking a 4th. In 1970, a book called The Friends of Eddie Coyle by George V. Higgins was released, and it was a massive commercial success. Yates heard about the book and decided to read it. He found it interesting and saw a potential for a film adaptation. Yates inquired about the film rights to the book, and he found that a producer and screenwriter named Paul Monash had already acquired the rights. By the time Yates had inquired, Monash had already written a script based on the book. Yates knew that none of his other scripts were ready to go into production, so the fact that Monash had already written a script was actually perfect for him. He met with Monash to discuss using his script, and Monash suggested that Yates direct. Yates agreed, and they started to move the project into pre-production. The story of The Friends of Eddie Coyle keeps the complex narrative structure from Bullitt, but greatly expands on it in a much more well thought out way, having many storylines that cross over each other and interlink, forming one narrative, but it's a narrative that doesn't fully form until the end of the film. The main plot follows Eddie Coyle, an old gangster in the city of Boston, who is long past his prime. Coyle hasn't moved with the times, and is still stuck at the bottom, stuck in his ways, unable to change. Coyle is still doing what he has always done, supplying guns to fellow criminals and taking on jobs that he would rather not do. But this doesn't cut it anymore, and the aging gangster has to do what he can to support his family and make ends meet. Coyle also has other issues, and it's not something he can easily wriggle out of. He faces up to 7 years in prison for a truck delivery gone wrong. With his family and age, he can't justify spending that time in prison, so in order to rid himself of the charges, he now has to rat out everyone that ever trusted him just to get a chance at potentially clearing his charges. Coyle isn't the only one with troubles, however, and friends turn out to be enemies in the world of thieves and skullduggery. A series of overlapping storylines, from bank robbers to gun runners, and even the local barman, slowly combine to paint a bleak and depressing look at the Boston criminal underworld and the fate of gangsters who can't escape a life of crime. The Friends of Eddie Coyle takes the same approach as Bullitt with its characters, only having a few main characters that are well developed. Where it differs from Bullitt is instead of having a main story with character side stories intertwined, the character side stories are all technically the main story, and each one is very important to the overall story, especially if you want to understand the entire film's plot. While Coyle's is the most important, the other characters' stories are a lot more than just subplots as they are in Robbery. Arguably, the main story, and certainly the main character, is Eddie Coyle, played by Robert Mitchum. Mitchum plays the old gangster superbly and gives an extremely convincing portrayal of someone who has been through it all and is just tired of everything. Even when he's not speaking, the way Mitchum moves and looks around gives off that sense of realization that he's getting too old for the life that he currently has. In the film, Coyle is initially presented as a down-to-earth, average working man, just trying to get by in life, but that is quickly dispelled as not being entirely accurate, and behind a veneer of a working man, we see an old gangster whose glory days are long over. He's old, slow, and now has a wife and kids he has to care for.
So if I don't have the time to explain married life to you, and besides if I did, you wouldn't believe me anyway, so let's just get down to business then.
Having to turn semi-legit in order to help make some money, simply because a life of crime hasn't paid well. Coyle now has to make deals with an ATF agent in order to have some hope of getting rid of his legal troubles. Over the course of the film, however, he slowly realizes that the law isn't so clean and that they are going to use him for all of his worth.
I should have known better than to trust a cop. My own goddamn mother could have told me that.
Coyle comes to the realization that he's just going to have to keep ratting out his former associates in order to just get a chance. Coyle isn't the smartest criminal, but he also isn't the stupidest either. He knows how to play people while appearing to be on their side. For the majority of the film, he thinks he's getting ahead and might have a chance until all of the cards are laid out for him and he realizes that that is very much not the case. He is honestly a sad and pitiful character, and while he's unlikable, you can't help feeling sorry for him because nothing ever seems to go his way. Not all criminals are behind the times, however. Some are managing to keep up, and one of those is Dylan, played by Peter Boyle. Boyle plays Dylan well, being able to capture and show the many different sides the character has. Dylan is similar to Coyle, but he's a lot slicker and cunning in a brutish way. Coyle trusts Dylan and sees him as a friend, but little does Coyle know that Dylan is doing exactly what Coyle's doing and ratting out his fellow criminals to the exact same ATF agent. The only difference is Dylan has been an informant for a lot longer than Coyle has, and he is a far more valuable informant. The ATF agent is Agent Dave Foley, played by Richard Jordan. Jordan does a great job at being able to play the part of a slimy agent.
The only one fucking Eddie Coyle is Eddie Coyle.
That's just using these old dried up criminals for all they're worth. He's the real mastermind behind everything and is manipulating Coyle and Dylan for his own ends. While Foley is technically the good guy, he shows the moral grey side of law enforcement and their dealings with criminals. The film shows us that they are not so clean themselves, and it's all just a game of ruthless backstabbing to see who can come out on top, except Foley has the law on his side, and at the end of the day, the odds are always in his favour. There are two other criminals that have their own stories, and are more important to the overall plot. The first is Jackie Brown, played by Stephen Keats. Brown is the supplier of guns for Eddie, and he has made quite a good bit of money off his illegal gun running, as evidenced by his car. Brown represents the new generation of criminals that are a bit more reckless than the previous generation.
Jesus.
Get your bowels in an uproar there for somebody else.
Hurry up, will you? Those look like fucking hammy guns to me.
Want to see one?
No way. Just fill up the bags and put a couple of loaves on top.
Even though he is more reckless, Brown is still a very cautious individual, knowing that what he is selling can get him put away for a long time.
The first is selling machine guns. That's life in this state.
Although his cautiousness only gets him so far, and just like Coyle, he finds himself being a pawn in Foley's game. The other criminal is Scalise, played by Alex Rocco. Scalise is another one of the older generation of criminals, similar to Coyle, being trapped in his old ways. He is still trying to get by, living out of a caravan and robbing banks for a living. Coyle supplies him with the guns to rob the banks, and the pair appear to be on friendly terms throughout the film. Sadly for Scalise, there's no honour among thieves. The term "no honour among thieves" is very fitting for the film, and in terms of the tone and style, the Friends of Eddie Coyle brought Yates back to the gritty crime films he was best known for. Yates honed his style from his experience on Robbery and Bullitt, combining many elements from both and interjecting them into the Friends of Eddie Coyle. Just like the previous two films, Yates shot the Friends of Eddie Coyle almost entirely on location in the city of Boston. In the film, Boston is grim, with its run-down buildings, trash-covered streets, and overcast skies that overwhelm the skyline. Yates' use of on-location shooting works well, and it's always a plus in my book, as it adds so much more to the film. It gives you those authentic environments that are always hard to replicate on a studio set. Despite how good some production design can be, you can't beat the real thing. Not all of the environments in the film are grim and miserable. There are some nicer areas, such as the banks and the bankers' houses. The film also has a good amount of colour, with there being many different colours featured, even some vibrant ones. Like this shot of the neon sign that is constantly flashing. It's just small things like this that varies it from having an ugly and boring colour palette, with all of the greys, browns, and blacks that you would typically expect. It's obvious time went into picking the locations and setting the scenes, but outside of that, Many of the locations do not feel welcoming and are places you probably wouldn't like to visit. Even the parks and the riverside have this quite dreary look to them. This atmosphere of the city made it perfect for the film, and the characters fit right into this aesthetic. Yates would build heavily on the criminal characters, and he shows an interesting side to the old gangsters, something not typically seen. Even though they are old and slower, it doesn't make them any better, and they are clearly shown not to be good people. The film gives you an unapologetic look at them and their lives of crime, showing them to be ruthless and professional, just wanting to get the job done quickly and smoothly, but they can be dangerously violent if something doesn't go their way. This take on the characters is almost like a mix between the criminal elements from Robbery and Bullitt, and I think it was well done. Another thing that I think is similar to both Robbery and Bullitt is once again the use of music over the opening credits, which sets up the film and some of the characters. The music used in the opening and the rest of the film is a mix of jazz and funk, and it fits right in with the style of the film. The music by David Grusin is a lot more prominent compared to the other two films, and is featured more throughout the film, but is still used somewhat sparingly. Because of this, the music doesn't override the drama and lets the scene build the tension for itself. This is especially done during the tense scenes with the first bank robbery, where there is no music for the majority of it, just the sounds of the environment and the robbers speaking. Interestingly, Yates decided to use music during most of the second bank robbery, but it's quite quiet and not used throughout. Now, where the Friends of Eddie Coyle differs from Bullitt and slightly from Robbery is in its pacing and the action set pieces. The film is slow and maintains a slow pace for the entire film. The pace of the film is even slower than Robbery. Even though the film is the slowest out of the three, it's actually the shortest by about 10 minutes, only being 1 hour and 42 minutes long. The slow pace matches nicely with the old gangsters and is very thematic with the rest of the film, especially with the bank robberies, which are very slow and methodical. The slow pace also works well as it builds up the characters and the story nicely, introducing new information as it goes along, enabling the audience to slowly piece the story and the characters together. The film is very different in terms of its style of action, and compared to the previous two films, there is very little action in the film. I think this was a good move on Yates's part, as constant fast action would have ruined the pace and theme of the film. The Friends of Eddie Coyle also doesn't feature a car chase, which I find is a nice change of pace. I think Yates made the right call not adding one in, as it would have probably been hard to top Bullitts, and he probably wasn't interested in doing another. Instead, the major action scene at the train station is slow and methodical, taking its time to build up. The little action that does happen is over so quickly it almost feels like it didn't happen. That's not to say that the scene isn't well done. It is, and it's one of the best scenes in the film, being very raw and impactful with the cars smashing into each other. All of it feels very vivid, but it's very different from the suspenseful train robbery scene in Robbery and the exceptional hospital and car chase in Bullitt. When it comes to criticism for the Friends of Eddie Coyle, my main issue is the lackluster cinematography. Going from Bullitt to the Friends of Eddie Coyle, it's a major step down, and it feels like reverting back to Robbery's style of cinematography, where it's serviceable but nothing that stands out. There is one bit of cinematography I do like, and that's this scene of Dylan and Foley talking. The camera is just placed far enough away that it feels like you're following them and listening in to what they are saying. But outside of that, most of the shots feel basic and boring, with little movement or thought being put into how they could have made the shots more creative and inventive, a missed opportunity in my opinion. A minor issue I have with the film is its story structure. On my first time watching the film, I felt a little lost in places and confused by other moments. However, on a second viewing, I found that many of the places I struggled with were no longer an issue, and I could easily understand what was happening. I bring this up because I could see this as being an issue for some people, but it's ultimately down to how well you can interpret the story. Outside of those 2 points, there's not really much else that I take issue with. The Friends of Eddie Coyle is a great film, and it's extremely solid. It has an exceptional story that takes a not-so-traditional approach in its methods of storytelling. It has an interesting and unique selection of characters that you would never expect to be interesting or likable, but yet I found myself fascinated by them, and those characters are played by a decent ensemble of actors who nail their parts. The film shows us a side of the gangsters we rarely get to see. It's a fascinating, unique, and at the time, a fresh perspective on a topic that has been done to death. Those elements, along with Yates' directing, make it seem so timeless. The fact that it exists and is so well done makes it stand out from the rest. The gangsters shown aren't young and energetic individuals that are all gung-ho and have all the money in the world to burn, but instead they are old tired remnants of what they once were. The film at times feels like a struggle, just like Coyle's life, and it gives a detailed exploration into this world of working class gangsters and the troubles they now have to face in an almost documentary-like fashion. It also gives you an interesting view into the police working with criminals, something that started with Robbery and was also featured in Bullitt, but it's greatly expanded upon in this film. While The Friends of Eddie Coyle was a return to form for Peter Yates, that didn't translate into box office success. It wasn't a hugely successful film when it was released in cinemas in 1973, and it failed to make back its estimated $3 million budget. However, it was highly praised by critics and audience members alike. Even today, it's still held in high regard, and for good reason. But sadly, that good critical reception didn't pay for the cost of making the film, and its failure led to Yates deciding to once again step away from crime films. He went back to making comedies and did 2 films called For Pete's Sake and Mother, Jugs and Speed, the latter of which was a success. Yates then went on to make The Deep, which was a huge commercial success and allowed him to go on to make other films that he was interested in doing, leaving the gritty crime films behind for some time. Yates would later state in an interview,
I like doing action films, but frankly, it's much more satisfying to make a film like Run of the Country than it is to make Bullitt.
Although he did like Bullitt and is proud of the film, it's obvious that he wanted to do more than just that. To me, it seems like Yates wanted to be known for more than just directing Bullitt, leading him to really try and branch out into other genres in order to have some success in other areas, which he did achieve, but it was never consistent. Technically, by making this video, I am contributing to that idea, as I am only really talking about his crime films, but sadly, that's his work I am most interested in and familiar with, although I did recently watch Murphy's War, which I thought was enjoyable with Peter O'Toole's performance and an interesting take on a war film. Today, Bullitt is what he is most well known for, and for good reason. As I have already said, Bullitt is a classic and deservedly so. The car chase is cemented in cinema history, and Steve McQueen's star power means its notoriety is not forgotten. Along with the fact that he never really found great success with a good number of his films, often underperforming or just breaking even, critically as well, his films would often get mixed to upper reviews, having the odd major hit here and there with either the critics or the box office. Peter Yates may not be the greatest director, nor is he the most well remembered, but he's a director that I think deserves more appreciation, especially outside of just Bullitt. He has directed a number of decent and enjoyable films that any film fan should check out if they haven't already.